Hello and welcome to Stampscaping 101. In this scene, I'm going to try something that I haven't done before. Nothing too extreme in terms of techniques or something like that, but just in terms of a combination of images. These waterfalls here I've used in many different scenarios, but I've never used them as kind of the components for some tide pools, okay? And I was looking at these the other day and thinking, I think I could use them with the Seaside Cove for a tide pool type of scenario. The waves kind of come in and it creates these little, little like mini waterfalls and those, I don't know, whatever you call it, the tidal zone. And it fills up the pools and whatnot. And I thought I would give it a try. In theory, I thought, I don't know why it wouldn't work. So I'm going to give it a try here with these falls and rocks and see how it would come together. All right, now this was a live stream and I've sped it up here 4 times the speed so you can kind of get the gist of it along with some instructions in a very quick manner for those that don't have the time to watch the entire very long live stream scenario. In those types of things too, I'm trying to figure out what I'm going to do. I haven't done the compositions before, so it's a lot of discovery for me as opposed to kind of instruction. All right, so what I've done here and what I mentioned to the people watching the stream is that it's kind of fun to add, when you're doing water types of scenarios, to add something like some things that you can see under the water. So that's where I stamped out those rocks in that tidal pool in a very light tone. This is the very large Seaside Cove stamp. It's the larger version. You can use the smaller version too. But I'm going to stamp that middle portion of it right above the waterfalls, like the water's coming in and crashing on the the exposed rocks, maybe in a minus tide. And, we'll see how that goes here. And it went okay. All right, now here's the thing. Those waterfalls, they don't transition into that, the Seaside Cove very well for a tide pool scenario, so I'm using the tops of the rocks, the same rocks that I used in that pool in a lighter shade. I'm just using it for the top up there in the waves, okay? So I can use, I don't think I go for 3 impressions of it. So you can see some rocks kind of, going out into the water, being exposed like that. And that created a nice transition right there. And I think that was really the key to the usage of these rocks in this type of composition right here, all right? And one of the things is you get a little bit of a scenic kind of visual continuity by having portions of the same rock used at a distance as right there in the foreground. Okay, so we're going to do this cloud here, and I kind of felt like doing it grayscale, but I know how people like color, so I don't want to make this piece too colorful, but I just decided to go with the dark blue here. I think it's a Prussian blue, Marvy blue, so it's fairly light. All right, so when you're using sky images, one of the things I always recommend to people is to kind of wipe off the perimeter and wipe it off really good with a dry paper towel so that the perimeter of rectangular shaped sky figures softens around that perimeter area when you wipe off some of the... Now, if you're stamping it out in a very super light powder blue or something like that, then maybe you don't need to, mop it off. But it's always a good idea because if you use your sky imagery in repetition like I am with this cloud stamp, when you wipe off the edges, it stamps out lighter and kind of more gracefully on the outside edge, and thus blends into other imagery around it very gracefully, okay? So you can see how that's kind of a darker blue in the middle and a very light, kind of, well, I don't know, not super light blue, but a much lighter blue around on that perimeter, okay? So it looks like the cloud is kind of glowing like that. And all it is, as far as the technique goes, is just mopping off the sides. You have to take off a little bit more than you think you're taking off, especially if you're going with a darker color, okay? Now I'm going for multiple impressions of the same inking and getting even lighter shades of blue, and that kind of creates this little opening for the cloud to be my source of light, where the light is kind of entering the scene from. So in a way, you're kind of creating your own light source like that. It doesn't have to be a moon or sun or something kind of official like that. It just could be a gap in the clouds. All right, so I'm toning in here, starting off with a Memento London fog. It's just a light gray. And it is blending a little bit. My inks are not completely dry, so when I went over my clouds a little bit, I had just stamped out my clouds, so they were a little bit moist, but that's fine. You pick up some of those colors and you kind of blend them around in the rest of the stamp, the rest of the scene, and you can kind of give your scene a little bit of color continuity, okay? So you go for a little bit of, I don't know, I guess shape continuity with the use of those rocks being used in, several different areas, different parts of the rock. You go for a little color continuity by tapping in these tones and, picking up some of the color that's already down there, and then you kind of blend them out. All right, now here's the thing that I was explaining to my the viewers that were watching this being created. But you see all these different areas of the card. You can call them different zones in some way. There's the sky zone up top, but see how I'm retaining some light areas up there. And then there's some darker areas. Most of the darker areas are on the perimeter, okay, with kind of central lighting. You look at that background Seaside Cove, the ocean part, the open ocean part, I should say. And I've retained some light within that space. Now down here in the waterfall area, I like to kind of model my forms. So at the base of some of these rocks, I'm making it darker. But in that pool area, the tide pool right there in the foreground, behind the foreground rock, I have that area illuminated in the middle. So you see all these kind of little areas of central illumination on different parts, the clouds, the open ocean, and then the foreground tide pool like that. You'll be able to see a little bit more prominent the darker I go. Right now, I was just mentioning to people, if you want to get into some little detailed areas, you can go with some markers, maybe some alcohol markers or dye-based markers, whatever you want. And that gets into those kind of harder to reach areas than I can with a wadded up paper towel like I use. All right, so you can go in there, color it out. I often don't do kind of the majority of my coloring with markers because it just would take so much longer. But I do love them for those little detailed areas. All right, now that's just one color, okay? And we already have our kind of lighting established. I'm going to get much darker in this one, but I wanted to add in some additional imagery. I wanted to add in kind of my representation of it's like some seaweed or something like that. So I just took my twisting leaves stamp and I stamp it sideways, and instead of leaves it becomes, whatever, some seaweed or kelp floating in the water there. Kelp's not this color, but I just kind of wanted to go along with the theme of the scene, kind of in those blues, grays, and kind of pale greens. At one point in time, I dropped that stamp and it kind of left an unintentional, undesirable mark on the page, but I just go in later and I just kind of blend that in a little bit. Okay, now I was just mentioning to people I'm going on with a summer sky here, and sometimes it's just easier to put a couple drops of re-inker fluid on your applicator, whatever it might be, and it just spreads out so much faster if you kind of employ the use of re-inker inks as opposed to just going straight out of a pad. It mostly with these lighter tones, I call them kind of my base coat colors, okay? When I get into my darker tones, I don't use a re-inker, I just kind of tap into the, the stamp pad. All right, so this is kind of a little bit more of a medium tone blue. And one of the things I kept repeating in the live stream, because I kind of teach those live streams as if they were like a live workshop, but one of the things that I always mention is it's usually with your medium to darker tones that when someone is coloring a scene, a lot of times they lose their light, meaning that they go in so far with the darker tones that they just, oh my gosh, they lost all of their light on the scene. Okay, so just be aware of that. And I always tell them too, just use a very dry applicator. Okay, not with the first color where I used the reinker where I wanted to get a lot of coverage, but when you start moving up into those darker tones, I really start using a very kind of dry brushing style of approach by having very little ink on that paper towel. So if I want to make something darker, I just tap it longer in an area than just inherently having it so wet that it leaves a dark impression to begin with. It's harder to control that way. You can, if you do things kind of in a more gradual fashion, you can watch as that tone develops and gets a little bit darker and brighter or whatnot, rather than just going on with a kind of more of a spontaneous, like instantaneous application of media. Okay. All right, now I'm masking off the Seaside Cove here and giving the top of the horizon line, you know, a kind of a more distinct line, separation between the surface and sky. Okay. All right, going in and adding some shadow work into my scene. Usually, if there's rocks or objects, I give the base of those objects a little bit of a darker color, and I will go into it also with black. Okay, so see that? You know, the areas are often brighter in the shadows because they're not being washed out by, you know, kind of bright sunlight. So I kind of deepen the shadows that way. And this is using the same blue that I stamped my clouds out in, the Prussian blue. It almost looks black, you know, in terms of the case. All right, so going with black here. And I just keep using my same, you know, so-called applicator, I guess. It's just a wadded up paper towel. One person said they always get these little, I don't know, marks or something like that using the paper towel, but I showed them, hey, you have to kind of squish it down, you know, and smooth it out because all paper towels are textured, and if you don't want that pattern being applied, then you got to get rid of the pattern. So you just kind of scribble with your paper towel a little bit, and it will smooth it out and give you a nice flat surface to work with. It's almost like doing like finger painting. Okay, so I'm giving that horizon line an even darker tone. You know, so it's not a futile thing. You know what I mean? You're not losing the benefits of adding that in the lighter tone underneath the black. Okay, it's a completely different looking black. If you put black over the top of blue, it looks more, I don't know, kind of steel blue or some incarnation of the, or combination of those two inks, because even the black, as dark as it is, it's still transparent and the colors underneath are going to show through. All right, so adding in a little bit of a darker area up top. See, I went pretty dark in the bottom corners and the top right corner, but I didn't make the area around the left-hand upper corner darker because my opening of the, you know, the clouds letting in the sunlight is from right there. So, you know, I don't make it so dark right next to, you know, in this case, the light source of the scene. All right, so see, I've kind of deepened my shadows on those rocks too, and the, you know, within the waterfalls, I've left some of the rocks nice and light, as if they are reflecting the light. Okay, and at this point in time, I think I was thinking about adding in potentially some splatter painting, or in this case, I wanted to make the water a little bit richer looking with the use of this Caribbean blue, which has a little bit of warmth to it. And it kind of, I don't know, brings some areas to life a little bit. Now see, I'm talking about streaking in some shades of this color, but look how many times I go over that same area and see how pale that application of that Caribbean blue is. It's like a streak. That's what you want. You want to be able to do things with repetition in order to get the desired kind of end result. but that's better than trying it in one with like a super juicy applicator and going across there and like, oh my gosh, I got too harsh of a streak. In this way, you're always getting these really soft applications by doing this, applying kind of your media in like a dry brush application. Okay, that's when you really remove a lot of the moisture out of your brush, usually when oil painting or acrylics or something like this. This is like some kind of, I don't know, incarnation of that type of spirit. But instead of paintbrush, good old paper towels. All right, so I wanted to create a little bit of a stronger horizon kind of a separation. Adding a little bit of a stronger vignette on the corners, on the edge of the paper. The darker you make an area of your card, doesn't matter where it is. I usually do up, all four corners. Not in this one, but 3 corners. But the darker you make some areas, or the darker you stamp objects into a scene, then the lighter the light areas are going to seem by contrast. If you make some area of the card 1 step darker, then everything else that's lighter than it will seem 1 step lighter, again by contrast. All right, now this is, the scene I thought was looking okay, but I'm going in here and adding a little bit of this antique linen distress ink, just to kind of, I don't know, give a little bit of a earthier type of incarnation to the different colors in here. The blues, the grays, the blacks. And it kind of, I don't know, it warmed them up a little bit. But again, it's just kind of twisting the color scheme. Or you might say expanding on the color scheme, going into kind of that earthier, kind of brownish tinge. I used it very, sparingly too, but it's still in there. But I thought that kind of made the scene a little bit richer. Okay. I'm trying to think what I was thinking here. I should cut this part out right here. But I'm trying to think of if there's anything else that I want to add in before I do my white pigment ink, foggy kind of, I don't know, in this case, maybe, ocean spray or something like that, okay? Now, where do you add white pigment ink, okay? And why, if you've tried it, why didn't it work for me, okay? When I start using this pigment ink, I always start applying it in the area of the scene where I've maintained a white element, okay? That white element represents light coming from the sky and reflecting off, in this case, the pool right here. So I'm adding in like a very light touch of that pigment ink. You want to kind of think of it like you're applying a very dry, very light powder application, if this was someone doing makeup, think about it like adding a kind of a nice blush or foundation or something like that, as opposed to like a clown or something like that, adding, like cold pack cream. So I'm showing people that's what people usually do. And that's, see that little amount like that on the foil, that's what you want. But oftentimes people just go straight out of a sopping wet white pigment ink pad and just dab it in there with their cotton ball, and then they just go straight onto their scene. So they have this sopping wet cotton ball full of, moist white pigment ink, and then they just go straight into their scene as opposed to tapping off, I don't know, like 90% of it, maybe even more. So in other words, you just want to get very little of that pigment ink, and then you want to apply very little at any given time. All right, so see that? It's like, like I said, it's almost like the spirit of applying powder onto something. But look at that. Look at those clouds just glow so, I don't know, gracefully like that now. Again, with that white pigment ink, it's putting on this very thin layer of pigment ink, white pigment ink on there. Look at how that little area that I've retained, that little cloud down, right around the horizon. Look how much that one's glowing now, just from the use of this white pigment ink. Okay, it's not hard, but people make it hard, and they almost do it every time. And I get it too, because when do we do like dry brushing types of applications in stamping? We're usually going for full saturations of everything. Dye-based inks, pigment inks, using markers. We're not going, we don't want to apply like a dry marker or something like that. But in this case, when you're going for like a very soft application of something, you got to make it dry, and you got to make it kind of very gradual in terms of your additions. All right, so I think that's where someone was asking about the paper towels, or made a comment on the paper towels. Oh, cotton balls too. 100% cotton, not the synthetic ones. They don't work at all for me. All right, now adding that kind of misty type of, I don't know, glowing mist down in that pool area. That would be really akin to some photography for going and doing like a long time exposure type of photograph of some area with waves and whatnot. It gives it that kind of that real whimsical, mystical look. Crashing waves, if taken on with a long exposure, it tends to look like mist or fog or something like that. People do it with rivers too, things like that, where there's some little white caps, moving through the landscape. All right, so Dr. Martin's bleed proof white here, splatter painting some crashing wave splashes into the scene. The scene's looking very calm and glowing and blended, but this is the ocean, so I want to give it a little bit of contrast and give the scene a little bit of dynamic movement. Okay, and when you splatter paint these little white dots into the scene like that, it really gives kind of emotion into that area. I often use it more for things like stars, snowfall. Yeah, those are pretty much the two things that I use it for the most. Right now at the base of that little waterfall, adding in some splashing. Sometimes it's hard to direct, the direction of your splatter, but do a little test thing. You don't have to always test things directly onto your scene. Do splatter a piece of paper or something. All right, now here's my little fisherman, but I stamped him low, so I cannot see his fishing pole. Is like his rod is like at the same exact angle as that rock there. So what do? You give the fisherman a rod right there with a pen, right? And there you go. Maybe he's reeling one in. Okay, now here's the thing. I was thinking, oh, I need to add in these salmon here. I noticed them in a couple people's scenes fairly recently, and it's like, okay, I don't see that fish being used in many scenes, but I want to make these fish look like they're under the water, so I'm stamping them in a very light value, in this case, gray. Okay, see a little, those little fish down there? They're very light, so it's, yeah, you see these little shadows, when you go fishing, they're not so crystal clear usually. So you do them in a lighter tone, and it looks like they're more under the water, than, some fish right on the surface of something. All right, now here, white paint pen, going in and adding in some highlights into my scene on some of these clouds. I don't add too much in there because there's already all that splashing kind of a movement of the splatter painted Dr. Martin's, but just going in, adding that little tiny bit of highlighting on some of these clouds, and that makes those clouds look a little bit more three-dimensional when you have those highlights on them. You can highlight anything and it looks more three-dimensional that way. So on these rocks, I'm adding some top lighting and adding a little bit of a shimmering water in that tidal area. So See that I'm just kind of adding these little dots in there. And it's like a white dot in, largely a white area there, a very light area. So it doesn't stand out too much, but it gives it a little bit of a kind of three-dimensional, not volume, but I don't know, surface texture, I guess, surface lighting, and highlights are lighting. They represent, some object reflecting whatever light is coming from that light source. All right, so here's the thing. If you're doing like a sunset scene where everything's like the lightest thing in the scene is yellow or something like that, then you would do your highlights in a similar color to that. All right, so let's see. What do I do here with the pen blabbering away? A lot of times in the live stream, someone asks a question, so... All right, now I'm adding in a little bit of extra bling. Might as well if you have these types of pens. Now see, that silver doesn't show up at all, right? Because it's darker, but I'm kind of holding this up, trying to capture the light so that people in the live stream can see, the ocean kind of coming to life a little bit. Here I'm putting in some splashing water down there with silver, and sometimes you can't see it, sometimes you can, depending on the light that's reflecting off of it. So kind of pivoting the scene here on a little bit of axis, but you can see some of those silver features revealing themselves. Okay, so if you have it just set like that, if it's not kind of angled up at the light, then you really can't see it too much. All right, so if you've heard of a Wink of Stella pen, I'm going to add in some Wink of Stella kind of additions here. This one's the clear Wink of Stella. All right, you can barely see it. I could barely see it, but look at that right there. It's kind of making that, the surface of the ocean a little bit more kind of glistening like that. It's like a little bit of iridescent shininess. It's not so glittery, but there's a little bit of a sheen to it. I was kind of joking around with the viewers that, it looks like, there was like a race of for snails crawling across the scene. So there's these little kind of shimmery, iridescent kind of streaks in there. I should use that Wink of Stella for a snail scene sometime. I do have some images of snails from other companies that I have used with my stamps in the past. It's really fun because you kind of do a worm's eye view of a scene. All right, just mounting the scene. I wanted to show people what this card would look like finished off in a card format. I just eyeball things. I don't measure it, so kind of giving it that little bit of a white border right here. And when you do that white border, if you've ever used things like the white acrylic paint pen for little details, or in this case the white paint pen and Dr. Martin's Bleed Proof White splatter painting, then that little white kind of perimeter there kind of pulls out those types of elements. And, anything white in general too, so it's like re-emphasizing the lighting of the scene. All right, so we're going to mount this on just a paper that I happen to have a lot of, which is the dark, super dark navy blue glossy cardstock. I have a ream of it from like 30 years ago, so it works good enough for me. You can find black glossy cardstock a lot easier than you can this super dark blue one. I only bought the dark blue one because it was on a clearance sale at Kelly Paper one time, like 30 years ago, like I said. All right, so just kind of trimming it up like that, and that should do it. This card went out to, was dedicated to my dad. My dad's memory. He used to love going fishing, and he always used to take us to the tide pools, and always loved that trip going out there and kind of exploring around in the rocks and seeing all the different creatures and whatnot. So wanted to send this one out, Dad. All right, thanks so much for watching.